What I feel is important is that every voice matters. Belief has validity, regardless of whether you agree or would live in a similar way. That doesn't really matter. What matters is that we are human.
Same house that's had like loads of parties and poetry readings and stuff.
Yeah, I would probably describe them more as gatherings. But yes, the house that has all the gatherings and the poetry and music and fire nights. Yeah.
What do you see the difference as a party and a gathering?
So, my experience of parties comes through the lens of spaces where obviously there's hedonistic fun and a tendency potentially to try to lose consciousness or severely alter consciousness in relationship with others, which no doubt is fun. And the way that I describe gatherings, or at least the way that I enjoy hosting or creating gatherings, is through a place of bringing people together with consciousness that often lacks substances or alcohol. So is very much focused on building, I don't know, rapport and depth and intimacy in relationship through sharing of a fire or sharing of poetry and music, sharing of time. Doesn't mean that alcohol isn't like it's banned. It's just not a focal point. Like people aren't like, let's get drunk or let's get high. It's more like, oh wow, like I'm really moved by someone's vulnerability or expression. And then that's the glue of the coming together versus the partying or what I describe or know to be a party.
Beautiful. Okay, and then so if you're bringing cacao or like a plant medicine or something into the space, it would be like with the consciousness versus with the desired outcome or something like that.
So, yes, and hearing that, I want to mention that we don't, like, I've never brought cacao actually into any of the work, like Primal Gatherings, or into the space, mainly because of, I guess, the affiliation of promoting a cultural ritual that there isn't a deep connection with through like heritage and understanding. So the things that we bring in that are the center points of our communion have been, as you know, like land regeneration, poetry and music, some form of expression often is what brings people together and why people come to like Albion where I live as opposed to a substance or something to consume. Although we invite people to bring their own foods like potlucks and stuff to contribute and also just to give that like at home family vibe.
Amazing. And has bringing people together always been part of your life?
I would say that bringing people together has become a big part of my life. I would say from early 20s, that's when it kind of started or was triggered or catalyzed. This sense of when you bring people together, there is a real sense of magic that ensues that really erupts through the lens of bringing so many different characters that through, I don't know, cross pollinating within each other, there is a lot of unpredictable beauty and just like magic that enlivens in a space. So noticing the power of that, like through the curation of people that you bring into the space and the possibilities that can ensue, whether that's through the lens of a gathering of poetry and music or a hackathon or a land regeneration mission, that the power of bringing people together is always something that is way bigger and more potent and more live than anything that I could possibly, I don't do alone. So there's a real joyousness and movement from my soul to, yeah, keep bringing people together and keep watching and observing and just facilitate through creating the container and then letting like what is emergent just show up in its own way that it wants to be presented and allow space to be surprised, if that makes sense.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, let's talk about how you grew up, where you grew up, what your childhood was like. I know a little bit because I think because when we first met and we were talking about Surrey, I think I was dating a guy from like a village near where you lived at some point. But then obviously you have like an American kind of accent.
The
Spent
deep,
loads of times in Portugal.
yeah, the decoy. The decoy is the accent. Yeah, so this piece around like how I grew up is, I shared with you that this is probably like the first time I'll like publicly speak about it because there is a lot of relevance connected to how I grew up with how I show up in the world, what I feel is important, and why I do what I do. So, my context was that I grew up with a mother who was unknowingly manic depressive until I was 17 and who really struggled with the world, with what was expected of her, of what she felt she needed to be, and the depth of essentially like her pain in trying to hide and isolate from the world, the responsibilities that the world would ask from her, and how she felt like she might need to be presented in like more public contexts. Her emotional well-being was very up and down in a way that was definitely not comfortable or very safe for me as a child. And that unknowingly, obviously through retrospect, really shaped my real passion actually for creating contexts and spaces that are really supportive of people to really feel accepted and allowed, essentially, or permission to feel their pain and show up messy if they need to. Because I realized through the way that I was brought up and the pain that I still, witness through my mother's, progression, I guess, through life, is that if she had had people or a community or spaces where she could feel safe to show up messy, then I believe that things could have really evolved in a completely different direction. And so my upbringing was very much coping mechanisms to try to figure out, how to manage this person's emotional well-being and really mitigate disaster. And, there was a lot of pain and suffering that came as a consequence of that. And through that, inspiration in some ways of, wow, like I really can understand the depth of pain that someone can go through that is both their own and self-inflicted. And how can I, as someone who grew up in that context and circumstance, be able to offer spaces so that people don't feel like they have to resort to isolation and loneliness? Because in isolation and loneliness, we exacerbate actually our mental unhealthiness, so to speak. And we actually really need each other to co regulate, right? From a nervous system perspective. If you see another human, you co regulate. It's part of, our well being. We need to be around others. And so that piece of, my upbringing, although sounds, very messy and sad and all the things, which, it was, and it was very painful to endure and watch and observe, really, yeah, speaks to actually what I witness as a big loneliness epidemic that contributes at a greater scale to, the repercussions of how we treat our environmental landscape. Because when people are so lonely and depressed and unknowingly, depressed, then there's a tendency to become self absorbed. And that self absorption is a survival instinct in order to just, make do with your day to day, which as a consequence means we ignore our greater landscapes, our relationships, our environmental world, participating in political discourse, showing up for things that are bigger than just us. And so that's kind of like that's the beginning basis. But speaking on these other points that you shared around my accent and my schooling, I went to boarding school at 10 as a consequence of my home environment. That was a very interesting space and also helped shape the way that I relate to authority for sure, and how I question the systems that I was a part of, especially because I went to an all girls Catholic school for 3 years. And because I said so, just never just never sat well with me. I couldn't help but question the what do you mean because you said so? Like, can you really share with me the depths of your why? Like, what are you afraid of, you know? And those pieces and puzzles essentially moved me closer to, questioning the way that things are as they are. Why are they as they are? Why do people act in the way? What are the norms? How imprisoned do people feel by their assumed cultural norms, especially nuns in the Catholic context? And the American accent is as a consequence of going to an international boarding school for 4 years after the Catholic one, and also because I would go and visit my grandparents 3 months a year, and they were based in Arlington, Virginia, because they're Russian immigrants that landed in the United States. So the accent piece is a mystery that people generally are quite fascinated by.
So where were you from 0 to 10?
Oh, I missed that part. Yeah, I was here. I was in London.
And your parents are from, so your grandparents, is that your dad's side?
My grandparents are my dad's side, yeah. So my mother is Abkhazian originally, which is a former state of Georgia, and my father is from Moscow.
And they met in London.
They met in Moscow, and then they married in the UK. And my mother moved to the UK to, yeah, be with him.
Huh. And then his parents ended up moving to the US.
So it feels like I've butchered the story, so I'll start again a little bit. But essentially, my father grew up in Moscow, Russia, and at about 17, 10 years after my grandfather defected, essentially, they followed suit to kind of find him, landed in the UK, found my grandfather. My grandmother felt quite betrayed by the fact that her husband had left 10 years earlier without letting her know. And so they decided to carry on and try their hand at the United States. So they landed in California with not very much money, the traditional story of the American dream and making a new life. And from then, my father then went to university in California, and my grandmother also found a job at a university in California. And that was that piece. So then my dad's landing in the UK happened in his professional life. He was invited to spend a year or two in the UK in in his workplace, and he just fell in love with the UK and then decided to stick around. So that's kind of how that piece happened. And then I'm the first generation of my family basically to be born in, yeah, in the Western world, I guess, in the United Kingdom.
Amazing. And where did your mum's family end up?
So my mom's family stayed in Russia. Her sister moved to the UK maybe 20 years ago, but other than that, the majority of them stayed in Russia, and she was alone here in the UK. My mother and father were together for about a year and a half, and then she stayed in the UK in there after they divorced.
And did your dad stay here as well?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, so they're both here still in yeah, living actually not that far from each other.
And do you have any other siblings?
Yeah, so I'm one of yeah, I'm one of five, or six actually. My father remarried twice. So I'm from the first marriage, and then in the second marriage, I have two brothers, Zachariah and Rumi. And then the third marriage, I have a brother called Lev. And then from the third marriage, there's also we also have a stepsister and a stepbrother, Lisa and Sasha. And I'm about 9, 10, and 15 years apart from my relatives.
Wow. Okay, and then so you stayed living with your mum after your parents split up
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I did.
and first went to that Catholic school and then went to a different. Where was the next school?
Yeah,
The
the next
international school.
yeah, the next school was in the place I told you, right? It was in Surrey, I guess Cobham, and it was an Americanized international school, but it was also a boarding school, and I boarded 5 days a week.
And why did you move?
From the schools?
Yeah.
Oh, so the all girls Catholic school was very strict, and I was naturally a very expressive child. And given my upbringing and my context, there was just this inherent rebellion within me and this like severe distrust for authority. And I don't know how familiar you are with like a Catholic
Yeah,
context.
I'm Catholic.
Oh, okay.
But I think it's more chill in Australia. But yeah.
Okay. So that school in that, you know, evolution of utilizing or bringing in some of the Catholic principles was more just, there's a sense of order. There's uniform, like you don't paint your nails, you don't express yourself through makeup, like things need to like go as planned, and there are no anomalies. And there wasn't very much space for like negotiation. So, like you have to be back by 8, you don't see other boys, like there's no discussion. And I, came from this context where everything was always up in the air and felt quite chaotic. So there was a lot of pushback that I would bring naturally, and that through that there was tension and there was some conflict with, yeah, just the those who were in charge. And so I found it quite difficult to be in that space where my voice wasn't heard, and I didn't feel like valued, I didn't feel seen. I felt like I had to adapt and shape myself to something that didn't feel natural or real to me, and follow rules that didn't make sense to me. And, I was an adventurous kid. I wanted to talk to the schools next door. I wanted to go on walks and like see greater landscapes. I wanted to hang out with older kids. I did hang out with older kids. And all the things that came really naturally, for whatever reason, was communicated that was wrong, or like that's how I experienced the communication. And so there was a lot of tension in that. And so at some point, I basically begged my father to shift me and to move me, and then we came up with a academic goal to for me to work towards, and then through reaching that academic goal, I then was moved to a mixed boarding school, which changed the game enormously for me.
Amazing. Yeah, I went to boarding school in England as well, so I know what you're talking about.
Which one did you go to?
Interesting. Headington in Oxford. But I don't know, I'm thinking like there's something about me like loves the rules and then like pushing against them. And I think but I'm similar to you that I do not like rules that do not make sense. But as you were talking about it, I've come to learn like a lot of people feel safe in an authoritarian kind of structure. They want this stuff to be passed down, even if it's like fear driven, and we saw some of this stuff play out like in the lockdowns and stuff, where I was kind of like, it needs to make sense to me. And like another human, like we're all human. So like, why would you defer to just like another human versus, whereas other people like, they want someone else dictating to them and that makes them feel really safe. And to have people like me or maybe like you questioning makes them really uncomfortable. So yeah, it's so interesting.
Yeah, I really experienced that too. So I have traveled the pendulum, right? Like I started maybe on this side of the pendulum of like, no, like I'm gonna question, I'm gonna push, I'm gonna like do whatever I want. I don't trust the structure, I don't trust the shaping. And then went the total other side of the pendulum of like, no, like structure and order is super important. That creates safety, that creates, the ability to be more creative. And like now, in my life, I've kind of landed in this like happy middle place. But yeah, this authoritarian, there is always this edge with it, right? Yes, in some ways it's comforting to have someone tell you what to do and just follow. And also like the removal of participation. I don't know if I can get down with that, right? Like I feel like participation is important and it's important to be in environments that support yeah, like some checking in, right? Like is this working for you? Does this feel healthy? Can this checking in inform the system? And that's kind of maybe now with like my age and my ability to reflect what I understand through retrospect I needed in order to feel safe in an environment. And in that place, there was no space for interpretation. There was just a rule, and it was followed. And if it wasn't followed, you were punished severely. And I just didn't like that.
Mm. So were your parents Catholic, not Orthodox?
So yeah, so my family has a very interesting, I guess, denomination. So on my father's side of the family would say that we are like 90% Jewish through the bloodline. My mother's side, there's Russian Orthodox. I was baptized in a Greek Orthodox church, mainly because I had a godmother who wanted to be my godmother. My half brothers are half Sierra Leonean and were raised as Muslims. So we have faiths of like Judaism, Muslim, and Russian Orthodox through our family line. I was not raised in any particular tradition. I went to a Catholic school of all places, but yeah, there's quite a mix and blend. And my brothers are also half Sierra Leonean, so we also have African family blood, which makes us, yeah, like a very interesting. I would say I used to joke and say that like we could be like an advertisement for the United Colors of Benetton, but it's definitely shaped the way that I see the world, and I feel so grateful actually to have such a, yeah, diverse faiths in our family context. It's really enriched and left a lot of openness in my ability to navigate and participate in the world for sure.
Amazing. And like for unity, presumably as well.
Yeah, completely. There's just, for me, I think growing up with a stepmother from Sierra Leone from the age of 3 had, from the get-go had me really understand that like everything and everyone has so much beauty and something so powerful to offer. And sure, we had all these different faiths. You have like the Jewish traditions, you have Muslim traditions, you have Orthodox traditions, you have all these different so-called competing or contrasting like ways of seeing the world that can coexist and live around the same table. And that, is how I approach my life, and what I feel is important is that every voice matters. Belief has validity, regardless of whether you agree or, would live in a similar way. That doesn't really matter. What matters is that we are human, and in our bases, and through that we can find a way to meet each other, and then like share the parts of us that make each other different, and then we can learn from each other, right? But that it's a something that actually brings us together as opposed to, divides us. So yeah, I feel very grateful for that opportunity, that upbringing.
And so were you close with your dad growing up? And could you like share some of the stuff that was going on with your mum, or did he know about it?
So their relationship was quite complicated. So there wasn't so much interaction. I would see my father one day a week on Sundays, and I think during that period of time, let's say from 0 to 10, I, for whatever reason, didn't feel comfortable to reach out and really share like the extent of challenge that I was going through. My mother, I feel through her own sense of insecurity and pain, often, yeah, would shape the way that I thought about him at an early age. I know now, like through age, that people have their stories and their beliefs, and it's important for them to feel like sided with, etc. So that made it a little bit complicated as a kid to develop like a deep relationship with him. But as I got older and we shared interests like going to galleries and travel and adventure and discourse and theater and poetry, etc., our relationship, yeah, developed over time. But more, I think, after, yeah, in my like mid to late adolescence, that's when our relationship really, I guess, like bloomed. But yeah, growing up, there was definitely a sense within me that like I kind of had to figure it all out on my own and find my way.
Do you remember at what point you, because I guess if that's the only context you grew up in, like was there a point when you realized that's not like what every other person's experience is?
Yeah, exactly. So I think when you're a kid, you have this like intuitive understanding when something feels wrong, but you don't necessarily know why. So I think, yeah, my experience was my early years was just the sense of like something feels off, feels really imbalanced. I shouldn't, be this sad this often. I shouldn't feel, this guilty as often. Like there must be something else out there. And I had this stark contrast between what I was experiencing at home versus what I was experiencing like at school or going to my friends' houses, which ended up being like my safe house, right? I had some really good friends who now I know parents who were aware of what was happening and were like, let me come over and let me come and hang out and stuff. So up until maybe like 8 or 9, I just kind of took things on board, and then I made a request to my father saying that like it wasn't working for me and I just needed something else, which is kind of how the boarding school piece arose. And through that, obviously meeting kids who have come from all sorts of different worlds and backgrounds and experiences and how they talk about their family and their siblings and their relationships with their parents, I understood that something was very different about the way that I was growing up. And when I was around 14, 15, then, all the hormones kicked in, the rebellion started to arise, and then there was a starting to like reject and find my voice and say no and find ways of altering or adapting my world in order to, yeah, essentially protect myself from the impact. And also, in some ways, I realized like survive, right? Like, there's this situation that when you're a little kid, you feel like you don't have any other choice. And I think adolescence is a really beautiful time in your life because suddenly you discover the word no. And there's a sense of like, oh, like maybe I do have a choice. And like, I'm going to, for me, it was, I'm going to fight for that choice. I'm not going to take this way of relating because I knew inside that I didn't deserve it. So I spent a lot of time actually outside, starting jobs at a very early age, from as early as 13, traveling for months, for long periods of time to my grandparents, visiting friends, like finding alternative spaces to be in and to contribute and to build relationships with that were outside of my home environment. And that, although it might sound like, oh, that must have sucked, in some ways I realized that it really helped me create this, like, when shit hits the fan, like, you gotta go, you gotta do something. How do you transmute and make beauty from your pain? How do you not let yourself sink from the depths of your feeling, but actually use it to, like, propel you and move you forward towards what makes you come alive? So yeah, that's kind of where a lot of that, yeah, came from.
And could your mum be supportive of your independence, or was that like really hard for her?
It was very, I would say it was very, very hard for her. She, because, she didn't receive her diagnosis, right, until I was 17. There was an internalization that often my autonomy that was growing over time was interpreted as rejection and her not having control over me, which exacerbated, very toxic ways of communicating it. And I realized, and I can understand that, right? Like, if you're positioned as the caregiver and this is your only child, then there's a sense of them distancing themselves from you. Of course, you might start to feel like there's something going on, and maybe they're, saying no to who you are. I did try, I think every child really does try to, like, meet their parent and show them love and try to understand their needs and try to adapt in order to make them feel more safe, or try to, like, bring presents home, or try to invite them to places, or try to do fun things, because I'm not alone in being a child who kind of was forced in some sort of caregiving role. And at some point, right, like, if all those efforts are continuously also in some ways rejected, you have to survive. And a caregiver's role really imprints and impacts a child's well-being. So if you don't feel met, and the communication is like, something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong all the time, your nervous system needs a space to restore and relax. And if things are wrong all the time, your nervous system can't relax. So, yeah, had to shift that. And with love, the way that I can love, right? Someone who's in that space, is to just try to respond with as much calm and care as I can. But that took time. That took years, and also work, inner work and awareness, to really, yeah, to own in. But when you're a kid, you don't get that. You're just like, what the fuck? This person is all over the place, and anything I do doesn't feel like I can meet it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so was part of you saying no? Sorry, I'm just because I've seen this pattern in people and I'm wondering if it's similar. So it's like the parent, there's like the enmeshment, like codependency. Like the parent really needs the child, but it's almost the child goes into like a caregiver role and then takes on all this stuff from the parent that they, so there's like a lot of responsibility and then even guilt, because, and it's like obviously there's so much compassion for the other person because it's like your mum is, in the context of however she grew up and whatever suffering that's just, and for anyone else's parent who's been in it, it's, that's how they're adapting and how they're trying to survive, that they are, anyway, so saying it with a lot of compassion. But then it becomes this dynamic of guilt. So that's what I was wondering. And people like carry this, like a lot of like the people close to me that have experienced it. It's like they're still really carrying it in adulthood and really pulled into the dynamic, but trying to pull away, but then experiencing the guilt. And I think people have this on like way smaller levels as well. I think, yeah, I've experienced it as well on like a much like smaller scale, and it's that, and maybe even, sorry, just in the consciousness, the idea of sacrifice and martyrdom, and like you have to like give everything of yourself to someone else, and you're wrong, maybe especially as a woman, like you're bad as a woman to not like have zero boundaries and just give yourself, and then you can feel the guilt. So I'm wondering if it's you saying no, part of that was saying no, like to the guilt, to the like holding. I mean, which is so, I can't even imagine what that's like for a 15-year-old, but to be able to hold on one hand, like compassion, you're suffering and you feel abandoned by me, but I can't, I'm not, that's not the reality because you are an adult and you can't be dependent on me, the child, for your survival, even though it might feel like that. And anyway, trying to hold all that at once whilst finding your own way in the world.
Yeah, yeah, totally. The way that I would describe it, very similar to what you shared, is yes, there was a whole dependency, emotional dependency and validation that was on me, and suddenly I was responsible for this person's total well-being and emotional stability and absolutely everything. And so the level of responsibility and burden and guilt, right? That actually was probably the biggest piece of my inner work journey, and it's still till today, is this understanding that like what I am responsible is for my experience and the impact of my experience and how I show up in relation to you, but I am not responsible for your total emotional experience. I'm responsible for my part, right? Like how I showed up, maybe what I said, the impact on that. But like each person's context is so dependent on their own like history, right? And what contributed for them to show up in a certain way. And so, yes, I'd like to think that at 15, I had this like real good understanding that, this is not my responsibility and this is guilt, but I'm not choosing not to feel it. But at that age, I didn't have the vocabulary. I definitely didn't have the depth of awareness or the psychological reading, like, Robert Schwartz or any of these great practitioners, to inform that experience. So my experience was like, this is too much. Like, I this doesn't feel like the right balance between the two of us. I'm going to remove myself from this experience and distance as much as I can because I can't hold this much, which is where I kind of got to in my adolescence. So coming home for showers, trying to minimize as much communication as I could, finding all these creative ways to be of value in other contexts, build other relationships was how I coped. But yes, now looking back, I realized that was essentially what was happening.
Mm. And then there must be so much grief, right? Because it's like that's your mum, and like we all need a mother, and I'm sure there were, yeah, I guess when you think about in the parts model, it's like there probably were time, like I'm guessing, where it was like that connection as a mother, like with your mother, but then when the protector parts or whatever, the exiles are like taking over, and it's like you lose access.
Yeah, totally, totally. I mean, in the end, your caregivers are your caregivers. Your mother and your father are your mother and your father, right? I'm really fortunate that now I have a really beautiful relationship with my father, and I have that kind of like, oh, let's go for dinner, let's da 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 da. Um, Unfortunately, for whatever reason, my role in my life has actually been as a consequence of that context with my mother is actually learning how to mother myself. And in learning how to mother myself, in learning all the tools and experiences that I would have benefited from being in relationship to someone who, you know, maybe had more internal capacity to offer has supported me in being able to show up in the things that I do, in the context that I create to help others, right? To learn tools to really, sit in mindfulness, be able to nourish themselves, understand nutrition principles, understand selfless service, places and modes that are safe to express oneself, etc., etc. So my pain, although it seems, from hearing the story, I imagine sounds awful, which in some ways it was. I can look back and understand that there was a real gift in that experience, because what it offered me was that this pain that I experienced through her pain, is actually something that I don't want anyone else to experience. And I understood that my healing journey was really supported by community, by people who were willing to hold space for me and listen to my pain and, offer different ways of managing it, or suggesting different modalities and practices to support my own well being and to build my own emotional stability as a consequence of that. And so through that, like, oof, like, from that experience of someone that I obviously in my bones love, because this is somebody who brought me life. Like, I wouldn't exist without this person. So I have to be grateful. I have to honor that her pain and her sadness contributes to something. And I feel that my role has been to transmute that pain into something that is supportive and nurturing and loving and wholesome and unconditional, actually, for others, so that we can, to the best of our abilities, create spaces that people don't feel like they have to resort to this way of operating in the world. And that's what I wish for, would have wished for my mother when I was at that age, and what I would wish for anybody who feels alone or depressed or dependent, or very emotionally unstable, that they feel like they can ask for support, or at least ask someone to listen, which is actually what I realize what my mother probably needed. I was just not in the, I was just not in that position. I just needed food on the table. I needed a safe place to rest my head and someone to, be there and do homework with at that age, right? All
Mm-hmm.
the other stuff, I just, I didn't have capacity for. I wasn't a therapist at that time, which is probably what, would have been more contingent and supportive to where she was in that moment of her life.
Mm. But I mean, it probably ideally it doesn't fall on one person anyway, which is your whole point around community. And we see that happens a lot, particularly I think with men, like after divorce and the rates of suicide, and because if that one person is the only person you can ever be vulnerable with or you can ever share with, it's like, I mean, because also the person can just die or whatever, or it's like we need to, yeah, it's that thing of like, we're not dependent on any, because I used to operate from this thing of like, I was so dependent on someone else for like my survival. So like, but emotionally, so like breakups would be so painful, like feel like it's a survival risk, but it's like you're not dependent on any specific person, but you are dependent on people. Like as humans, we are social, like we can't just do everything on our own. And someone even, I was thinking this when you're talking at the start about community, someone said that to me the other day about, because I have that personality of like, you just do everything yourself, you don't ask for help, like that's kind of weakness and whatever. And I was like, yeah, I'm doing all the stuff like with people, because it's like, oh, with coach, like people you pay for, like coaches or whatever. And it's like, no, that's still doing it on your by yourself. Like being in community is like letting other people help you, because just for the sake of, because it feels good as humans to like help each other, not in a transaction or whatever.
Yeah, we need community, right? If I hadn't fallen accidentally into the community circles that I did, through my path of trying to figure out all this stuff, I would not be the person I am today. I am the person I am today because there were different people in my life that I could lean on for, for different reasons that weren't transactionally based, that weren't like, oh, I get to get this out of you if you offer this. No, like I'm here to listen and to support because I care about you, right? And there is this fear in this hyper individualized society that we've created, especially, contingent on like the way that the world of work works, that through airing that you're challenged or you're suffering, that you will be excommunicated, right? And when you're excommunicated, that's a real fear that's been with us since the beginning of time. Being excommunicated from the tribe was survival. So not speaking up and not sharing our grievances or our challenges is actually a way to avoid, you know being excommunicated, avoid our sense of survival being threatened. But in that, there's this like really twisted a piece where actually what we need is to learn to, just speak up and be held and supported by others. And community is amazing in that like different people have different presences, different energetic imprints, have different ways of different outlooks, different belief systems, different things that they can offer. And so, if there's one friend that you can speak to about this thing, and there's another who's great to speak to about that, and others who are just great people to like hug and cuddle, and others who really love music and can take you out. There's so many ways of relating in a community context that is holistic and like to your point doesn't make you dependent on like one person as a sole source of everything, but offers this ability to actually lean on a number of people, and feed different parts of ourselves.
Oh my God. And it's thanks to you. I've told you this, right? That it's thanks to you inviting me into a community that this podcast even exists, which is like crazy. And that I have, yeah, so much has come from that invitation. Like someone who's a really close friend of mine now, who's been in this podcast multiple times, Brian Cam. Another, like even just a few days ago, I did a financial freedom workshop with someone from that community. Like that's just like stuff constantly. And that would have been 2 years ago. So it's like the gift that keeps on giving. And it really was, it's so funny as well. Because when I met you, I was just like, oh my God, I feel like I don't know. I was like, to have that invitation from me, because I feel like, because it was at this Cambridge weekend, and I feel like I'm like outspoken or just say random stuff, and I have no idea how people like receive it. And I just felt like you were like, who the hell is this person or something? Then you ended up extending this invitation. I was like, oh my God. And I took it, and it's like changed my whole, yeah, it's like so much has come from it. I'm so grateful. Anyway, and it really, in a pure community way, a group of people who are just meeting, each bringing food, sitting down for dinner, and then helping each other just for the sake of like being in community. That was like a mind blowing idea for me. Like outside of family that might do that, I'd never like experienced something like that.
Can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
So hearing that and noticing that experience, what do you think that context contributed to support you to making this podcast?
So it was going, because the idea was like, okay, creative community, bring, like if you're working on something, you can like bring it and like ask people for help or just like sit with it and be in this space and work on it. And I came like, I want to start this podcast. I have no idea why. I've had this calling for so long, but I don't even know where to begin. And it was like the two people sitting next to me were both like, oh yeah, we have podcasts. Because I was like, I don't even know anyone who has a podcast. Like how? And it was like Yohim and Brian, who both then came on my podcast and have become like really special people in my life. And they're but it was, and Julia was like, they sat down with me, they were like, why do you even want to do this? And I was like, ah! Like it was such a strong thing inside me. They were like, whoa, okay, like this is something that has to be brought into the world. So they yeah, just held they were like, this is what, yeah, it was really, Julie was like, this is what you're going to do. When, like, how long do you need to publish the first one? But like, we're putting a date on it and it has to be done. Like, let's agree on the date. And then I think by that date, I'd published like 3 or something. But it was really, and then because it was like continuing to come back to the community, so it was like being held in that space to be like, okay, now I'm going to make the thumbnail. I don't know how to do it, but like just having, yeah, just having the support of people to like hold me accountable in like a loving way. And then I think it was the first episode, the intro episode I published. I remember it was the day the Queen was buried, I think, and it was a public holiday, and it was like a Monday, and I published the first one, and it was like, yeah, it was just so beautiful to do it in that context with that support. And I honestly don't know how I would have done it without just that push from people. And then also Nassos, like answering all my questions, like practical podcast questions. Anyway, not that, and it was just like everyone's there doing whatever, like learning Spanish or like painting or like whatever it is. It's just so, I genuinely never experienced that, as I think coming from the context of like working finance or whatever, when it's just like work and then social, you hang out with friends, but that piece of just supporting each other for the sake of it, and even outside of religious context or whatever, it's just amazing.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that that context supported you in holding you accountable, but also making you feel safe enough to confront maybe deeper parts of yourself that were obstacles to actually getting you to start. And when you were received in that and held in that and encouraged in that, that helps with this outcome, which is this podcast, which we're now speaking on. And that's the beauty of community, because in community, different people see different parts of you. And so in being feeling seen and then feeling known and then being received and encouraged and supported, there's something that really beautiful that arises, where when someone feels safe to express as they are, there's suddenly a rise in motivation to actually do that, right? Whereas a lot of these childhood contexts, mine and others, right, doesn't really, you don't need to have trauma or abuse or any of that to still feel sometimes quite restricted in being able to express. And that's a dependence on one or two caregivers. But when you have a community, let's say, the creative community that you were a part of that I invited you to, there's like 10 to 15 people. And suddenly you don't have just one or two people, you have 15 different people with different skill sets who see different things in you, who encourage you, motivate you, remind you, who hold you accountable, which actually could be different roles that different people hold, right? And so that's, why I guess I'm so passionate about community. Why, like, yeah, what I would have wished for my mother and other people in that similar context is because, like, if only you knew, right? Like, if only you knew that you could be so loved, supported, and held, and enriched, and reminded of your power, what you can contribute, the importance of your voice, and the presence, right? We often don't acknowledge the power of just our presence. Like, we don't even need to contribute. We don't even need to create anything. Our presence in a room at a dinner table alone, like, you know when someone's missing in a community context that you've been in countless times and the same people are there every week, and suddenly this person is missing. Like, you notice that. So, yeah, there's such beauty in community, and also in relishing and valuing who we are and the value that we bring just by being who we are.
Okay, we'll go back to your story in a sec, but I just want to ask, do you remember why you extended that invitation or what was going on? Because this is like this is like part of my manifestation process and how I see stuff so I wanted to bring the podcast into the world. I had this strong intuition that I should go to that weekend in Cambridge. And I was trying to use my mind to make sense of it and logically like ask people like, do you think this is a good idea? Blah, blah, blah. But I just had this intuition I had to go there. It didn't, and there was no like logic that was going to justify it. And then I feel like that intuition was connected to getting that invitation from you. And maybe also to meet this other that I haven't followed up, but someone like handed me this book there and this gift, and then eventually I'll like reconnect that. So maybe that's part of it. But it really felt like backtracking. It's like so good to follow. I don't know. A message from that for me is like following my intuition, not worrying about trying to make logical sense. But I wonder if that was like a universe. I don't know if there was just like a thing that felt like you had to give me this, even though you didn't know why, or if you can remember.
So, what I would assume is often when I meet people, like in other contexts, and they share something that they're with, let's say someone says, "Oh, like I don't feel like I've met much community in London, or it's a lonely place." I'll just give this as an example. I'll be like, "Oh, well, do you like poetry and music?" And they'll be like, "Oh, yeah, I do." I'm like, "Well, we hold this poetry and music gathering. Like, you should totally come." Or in your case, oh, I have this idea of starting this podcast, but I don't know, da 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 da. And I happen to know that there's a community of people who meet to support each other, to be accountable to their creative like expressions or what they want to bring into the world. So I'm like, oh, like you should totally meet this group of people that I know might be supportive, or at least experiment and experience what it might feel like to be in that context that could help you with what it is that you're tackling. So I think because I find so much value in communities, starting communities myself, being part of many different types of communities, there's just a natural sense within me to invite people to these spaces because I know how healing they are, and there's some sort of intuitive sense that they might get something out of it. And if I could support that Brit and be that bridge, then I'd love to.
Oh my God, amazing. Okay, and then, sorry, I'm just thinking because I think I would have been operating from a place, and I think a lot of people do, and that's like the increasing polarization, or whether it's increasing or not, like there's polarization. And people feeling like I have to be with my tribe, and are these people safe, and but even in a schoolyard thing of like, am I liked or something? So I feel like I was projecting this thing of like, oh my God, am I welcome? I think that was a powerful, that was so much fear. Sorry. There's like so much fear as well around this podcast, talking to people, all different types of people. I felt like it's not allowed, like, because it's like who you associate with and blah, blah, blah. But you obviously, well, I'm guessing it seems like you operate from this framework of like we're all human and like welcoming everyone into community, and it doesn't matter like which team you're with or that doesn't exist. It's like in community it's like you can bring your full self and everyone's welcome, and that's the like stuff that I feel like needs so much healing in the world. Like so many people are suffering and feel like they have to find where they feel safe because it's not safe. It's that exile thing you were talking about. It's not safe for them to be who they are in so many contexts. And then it drives people to move further apart.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that piece that you just named is informed all the work that I do with authentic relating and has informed all the work that I do with primal gathering. It's how do you create the right conditions and containers to support people to feel like they can welcome everything in themselves and be welcome with and by others. And that alone, even though it sounds really simplistic in nature when I boil it down like this, is insanely healing, right? For people's nervous systems. Because what happens when you're given that level of safety and support? When suddenly, like, am I welcome? Can I show myself? Is this right? Is this okay? Like the anxiety drops, right? The mind can start like relaxing, oh, my perspective is valid regardless of my context. Because I would imagine the story I have is, oh, I'm from finance. I might not fit in this like creative context, or people might think of me in a certain way because I work in finance. Just making this up. I'm not saying that that was your reality. But when you go into a space where actually none of that really matters and just who you are, Dealer Burgess, hope I'm saying your name right, is welcome. There's something, there's this aliveness that showed up in you, right? There's like this, like, oh my God, these people aren't my family. They don't work with me. I'm not offering them anything. I'm just arriving. And here I am, welcome. And now I'm finding the strength to show up, strength to really be who I actually am. And it might sound drastic or like a big generalization, but I do feel like that little pinpoint would really contribute to supporting and shifting some really polarizing and divisive, tendencies that we have in various different societies and various different cultures. If we could all sit around the table the way that my family, I'm not saying my family's perfect, as we know, but just even like the Muslim, the Jewish, the Russian Orthodox, different beliefs sitting around the table and like, having opposing views, but welcoming it and being okay with like you as you are, me as I am. You watch Fox, okay? I mean, I definitely don't agree with it. I definitely wouldn't watch it, but you know what? That's you. And like, but I trust that like your contribution and your love for the family or the way that you make a pot roast and my whatever I do outside, like we can meet as humans and that to be enough. And this enoughness piece, right? It's something so many of us are challenged with. Like, am I enough? Are we enough? Is this right? Am I in the right space, in the right room? Da 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 da. But if we can sit in our power and know that we are inherently valuable, that we are inherently enough, regardless of all the other stuff, and still be able to break bread together and still be able to, see the beauty and the expression that all of us are here to bring, then we would really live in a different world. And I feel so fortunate that every time a Primal Gathering is on, I get to experience that, and it feels so alive that all these people from so many different contexts, right, are able to just plant trees together and it just be about that.
So powerful. Okay, I want to hear your journey from school to Primal Gathering. I know there's a lot, but like the decisions you made about like finding your independence as a teenager, what were you thinking about what you wanted to do afterwards? And how did that, I guess you'd already started working, so maybe, I don't know, how those kind of like your attitude to work informed like what decisions you were going to make. And then I know you mentioned on this other podcast about burnout and the work you were doing with the UN and starting in advertising and whatever. So I would love to hear how it all unfolded.
Sure. So a little bit of like a professional history in some ways, or like how like that informed. Yeah, cool. So I exited school with this understanding that I knew I was really creative. I knew that boxed contexts were not going to be a place of real happiness for me. And so I was trying to find ways to get paid for being creative, and advertising was what naturally fell into my lap. So I started in strategy, working for Unilever on their first kind of global sustainable movement in that at a media company called PhD, and was told by my boss at the time that I was far too creative for media strategy and I should actually be an advertising creative. And so I jumped into that. I went to a very edgy alternative school called School of Communication Arts 2.0, run by an extraordinary man called Mark Lewis, who rejected traditional academic systems of teaching and actually just wanted people to work on real world briefs with real people working in the industry as mentors. And so that really inspired me because he was training us to be world change agents and kind of using the advertising industry as like a funnel to to like get the people to think about real issues in the world, but then put them strategically in the advertising industry to like move and shape and influence the communications industry. So super intelligent, very rebellious man, and it really inspired me. It really inspired me to think about how we can use communications as a means to support social impact. And all my work, my portfolio was focused on those kind of strategies. So, how can you use big capitalistic or commercial brands to utilize and actually empower and elevate people in society? And so, I called my portfolio, along with my partner at the time, Alex, adpreneurs. So, we were entrepreneurial advertising agents. I got into the advertising industry. I was super psyched. I was so pumped. I definitely had a total different imagination of what it's like in principle. I thought I'd be able to actually action these ideas and learn really quickly that really bold and creative ideas were actually used to win pitches, but not actually to be worked upon. And what you actually work upon is, the changing words in different orders to, essentially sell, let's say, like a shoe brand or a phone or something like that. So I felt kind of disappointed and was very impatient. I want to do it now. And so I accidentally became an entrepreneur. I say accidentally because it wasn't my intention. I just started approaching companies directly with my ideas and just very ballsy, let's see what happens. And then, yeah, like I got asked to execute them, and then suddenly I had to find teams to make them happen. And so I knew nothing about, ooh, sorry. I knew nothing about business. I knew nothing about, managing teams. I knew nothing about budget, but I knew that I could make something happen and I would figure things out. And so I started to do that. And I was invited to a hackathon during that journey. And in that hackathon, I realized that there was so much potential to build social impact ideas, but at scale. If you invite 100 people, maybe you might get 10 small startups that have the possibility of creating new alternatives. And that really psyched me up. And the thought about what could you do to frame these hackathons through that lens, as opposed to like, let's build as much as we can, as fast as possible to make as much money as possible. And so I started to do that. So that was my introduction to gatherings. So, how do I gather a group of people from diverse backgrounds with diverse skill sets around trying to make the world a better place and see what happens? And everything was an experiment. Everything. Everything was just, let's see what happens. I wasn't attached to any ideas of how anything was meant to unfold. And so I organized hackathons for Product Hunt, and later on, like for Reckitt and Benckiser, Unilever, lots of these big name brands. And next thing I know, we're doing a global hackathon event for the United Nations in 9 countries simultaneously over a 72-hour period in 4 continents. And that was what felt at the time like a total dream come true. Suddenly, there was an opportunity to really deal with, or that was a thought that I had, was really attempt to find alternative solutions to the challenges that we all face, but from our local understanding, which felt way more appealing to me than coming up with an idea in the United States or in the UK and then trying to scale a model internationally, like the Starbucks effect, which I have a lot of grievances with. I just don't believe in it. And I feel like culture is such an important keystone in how we think about the challenges that we face and should be utilized more and more. And luckily, with the regenerative movement, is being utilized more and more. And so I embarked on this mission. It was successful. We built 90 startups in 4 continents over the course of 72 hours. We had a lot of press. We flew the winners out to meet the president of the UN at the time. And once arriving in the UN offices, I realized quite quickly that the real meaningful change was not going to happen in the way that I thought it was going to happen. And that happened for 2 reasons. One, because the winners were flown out from, Indonesia, England and India, and the amount of time and energy they were given were about 10 minutes, a few photographs in this glorious room that then could be posted on a number of articles. But then the question of like, and then was, was left hanging. And also just the in the hallway, I don't know if you've been there, what you'll see is that all the frames are maybe 98% white males in those frames. And so there was just this sense of like actually real change might appear outwardly and external, but there was something internal that was missing. And I collapsed. I had a big burnout. I felt a little bit jaded by that experience. Like we had worked so hard, and I really wanted those startups to be really appreciated and seen and acknowledged and celebrated. And I felt like they weren't. And there was a lot of, hope in that, and the sense of possibility in that. And then realizing that there was something bigger that I didn't know yet that needed to be attended to. And I burnt out. I got sick. I had surgery, and then I committed to another way. There had to be another way. And in that other way, there was this exploration, looking at different alternatives, trying to understand my internal landscape first. So, Vipassana meditation was a really big, as you know, as you've done it, change agent in how I observe the world. Things like breath work, dance, learning about nutrition, Ayurvedic principles, learning about nature and, herbalism, and looking at it through the lens of like as an alternative to the pharmaceuticals, and realizing that there was so much wisdom and knowledge out there that I had no idea about, and felt really passionate about bringing home. Like I just wanted people to learn the stuff with me, because doing it on my own would be simply too hard. And I needed people to hold me accountable, like you said. And so I started organizing these events under the title Primal, which was with the intention of returning to our primal nature and integrating these principles together and like learning from one another. And then in 2017, there were these big wildfires that occurred in Portugal, and the country felt helpless. And they felt helpless because the majority of the trees that went on fire were eucalyptus trees, which are highly flammable, very greedy, water intensive plants. And also because the large proportion of their plantings came from the commercial lens of selling paper, which Portugal is a big exporter of. And so I was left with this inquiry of how can we as people do our part to really encourage first the planting of biodiverse species to avoid something like this happening, as this generally happens in monocultures of eucalyptus trees. And the second is how can we create experiences that support people to fall in love with nature, because when people fall in love with things, they then have an inherent need or desire to protect it. And what I was doing with Primal felt, yeah, it felt meaningful, but also like very, again, self oriented. But what I did realize is those gatherings supported people to feel a deep sense of empathy and belonging. So my experiment was okay, like if people feel a deep sense of empathy and belonging, and then we were to introduce them to the natural world, what might happen? Could there be a transference with the natural world as a consequence? And can we help local landowners who are super outstretched, like totally understaffed, like usually very overwhelmed with the amount of work that they have to do on the land? Can we help them whilst empowering and teaching people skills around land so that they can also, yeah, become more self-sustainable in themselves? And through that initial experiment in 2019, and observing the project grow over the years, what we came to realize is that our model is actually has become the foundation of, yeah, a philosophy of what components can contribute to building a regenerative culture. And when I say regenerative culture, what I mean is the way that you would describe an apple being regenerative. You know, you pick an apple from a tree, you bite, you eat the apple, you throw the apple core, and it goes back into the ground, and the whole cycle, starts again. Like, how do you create contexts and environments that are not just extractive, but also replenish and are self sustaining? And so, what we realized is when you merge the principles of ritual, the structure of, predictability of, let's say, like meal times, you ritualize or you make a schedule of mindfulness, an opportunity to practice selfless service, which is, the land regeneration pieces that we bring in, an opportunity to have an awareness of your nutrition and eating from locally sourced producers or farmers, an opportunity to engage in discourse and intellectual, debate, and a space to express through voice or through dance. That in that, through cadence, and through a number of days of practicing that in a collective and equipping people with skills to be authentic and also honest about their experience, you can support a real shift towards regenerative values where people want to show up, where people care about each other, and they want to, like protect both themselves, their relationships, and land, but not through protection from out of fear, but more from a place of self, mutual, and a collective love for the world.
Amazing. I so want to come to one. The next one's in May, right? In the
Yeah.
UK. Um, okay, where did this social impact, like wanting to do good, come from?
You mean within me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine that since a very young age, there was always this sense of like collective betterment that felt like a big value that I held. And maybe, hearing this question and absorbing it in the very here and now, there was a sense that like if I am figuring something out, like it can't just be for me. Like me alone just felt like almost robbing, you know, other people of the opportunity of sharing, let's say, power, or sharing resources, or sharing betterment or well being. So, from a very young age, every idea I had was always through this lens of like, how can we empower the collective? How can I do my part to be of service to more than just me? Because, sure, I could have figured out everything I figured out with Primal and just kept it all for myself and that be my day-to-day life, which, to a large extent it's now become a very key and core part of my day-to-day life and how I structure my days. And why wouldn't I bring everybody else on board on the train to experience this with me? Because it's joyous and it's beautiful and it's enriching and it's nourishing my heart, and I want to share that, with others. I want others to feel that benefit. And how can I do that? um, I think is where it came from.
And what about your relationship with the natural environment?
So my relationship with the natural environment came as a consequence, actually, of my attending to my inner work, right? So through the vipassanas and through all the self discovery, I realized that my sense of compassion and my ability to see, like outside of myself and the world just deepened. And with that, there just became this love and affinity and deep appreciation for the environment, also because it offers and gives me so much, right? Like the peacefulness, the calm in my body, the teachings that a tree offers in its generosity, in how it's able to be, shade, wood for the fire, a house, the structure for a house, a place to read your book, a place that doesn't, you know uh, judge whether you're a criminal or a saint, that sits underneath it, right? And through that, there was just such an adoration and gratefulness, and actually a deep level of humility that I ended up really internalizing. Because the more, and this is my own belief here that I'll own, but the more that one understands the that we are a part of something, and we are essentially here to steward and to be guardians of each other and the natural world, the deeper a sense of humility comes, that at least for me, where I understand that like nature was here before me, nature will be here after me, and my role really is to tend to it and really learn from it, because the way that it's been operating when left alone works wonderfully without any interruption, right? But if I were to, interrupt, or the way that we have interrupted things generally, sometimes go well and sometimes really don't go well. And so I am a student. I'm a student of how nature operates and works, and everything that I've learned from even like the resilience that beech trees have with one another, where when a beech tree is low on sugar resources, ones that have an abundance will then, redistribute resources to ensure the strength of the forest. That for me is like an incredible example of community. And so, yeah, I can only learn from nature, and everything that I am internalizing about it, I then attribute and offer in my work. And I see it. I think we understand, right? Most of us who are in this space of regenerative culture design, or environmentalism or climate change, etc., we understand that like we have a lot to lose if we continue jeopardizing the state of the environment, and if we, yeah, cut down insane amount of trees, the impact on our air quality and our seas with the pollution that we put in it. And so, yeah, I think the more that you really feel the depth of gratitude for the world and life that you live, really, the deeper the accountability and the appreciation for what offers and supports your life, which I, would say nature is predominantly very responsible for.
And I guess also realizing there's no separateness, like we are nature as well, like, which is the whole primal thing.
Completely.
Okay, I'm just going to ask you the last three questions, unless you have anything else to add. And then we can hear more about like what you're up to at the moment and how people can find things. So how do you stay grounded?
How do I stay grounded? So I stay grounded by attending to my own, let's call them rituals, every day. So exercise is a big thing for me. Exercise every other day, and every morning I do breath work and I take time to journal. So that's two things that are really supportive. Reflection is a very big piece. And if I lose ground, returning to my breath or going out somewhere in nature can really support me in those moments. So that's probably my go to resources. And there's various others as well.
What's your breathwork practice?
So I flip and I flop. It's breath work or yoga often. I trained as a Kundalini yoga teacher and also do vinyasa yoga. My breath work can flit from Wim Hof, and sometimes it can go to YouTube channels like Breath with Sandy, who I love. Uh, and sometimes it's just a deep sense of awareness that I bring to my breath through counting, up 4, hold 7, exhale 8, kinds of things.
Cool. Is there a book that's had a big impact on your life?
Oh, there's so many books. Um, so there's two. There's Designing Regenerative Cultures by Daniel Christian Wall, who is one of my heroes and who has interrogated how do we design our cultures through the lens of using nature's intelligence to support us in living more cohesively and reciprocally. And Unbound, which is a completely different book by Kasia Urbaniak. Do you know it?
Oh my God, I'm reading it at the moment.
Yeah, which is a badass book about how to, as a woman, really understand and stand in your power and really lean into from a place of feeling like you have choice and autonomy to choose how you show up, which I couldn't recommend enough as well.
Amazing. And owning your desires, or even like being allowed to like get in touch with your desires, is like groundbreaking for me.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Okay, and then what are the 3 words that describe the best version of Nicole?
3 words that describe the best version. As in like me, like my character, or like
Yeah,
how
and
I
like
show up?
how you want to show up, ideally. I mean, you could say grumpy, but it might not. Like, whatever you want to go with. Not
If
saying you're grumpy, that might
that
be.
was the authentic expression. Sure. Yeah, I would say thoughtful, authentic, and open, flexible.
Beautiful. Okay, so how can people find you, learn more about primal gatherings, and learn about trust your nature as well?
Yeah, so everything connected with Primal Gathering or Primal Leadership can be found on primalgathering.co, and you can use those same words on Instagram and on Facebook, and you'll find us with a lot of ease. And for those who want or are interested in somatic experiencing therapy or authentic relating coaching, you can find me at trustyournature.co. And those are the 2 places that you can find me.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Delia, for your raw and inquisitive and curious questions. I really appreciate the curiosity and the softness in which you convey it in.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this conversation. Feel free to share it with someone if you think they'd get something out of it. And you can also subscribe or follow the podcast so then you find out about new episodes. And purely for my own ego, no, just kidding. I think it actually helps the algorithm and helps more people find the podcast. If you want to rate or review, like, go for it. And see you next time.